Hello lovely folks and welcome back. Now last time we looked at getting our shoulder seams and necklines all squared away. Hopefully that all went nice and simply for you and you're ready to move on, because today we're going to start our sleeve pieces. Now we're going to be using the same 3 stitches that we did in the last video. We're going to be using running stitch, back stitch and whip stitch, and this time we're going to be using a simple run and fell seam to keep these seams lovely and strong. So the first thing that we're going to do is add the first side of our gusset to our sleeve piece, and then we're going to join the sleeve piece to the main body. Simples. Ready to get started? Then let's go. Okay, the first thing that we're going to be doing today is getting these gusset squares attached to our sleeve piece. If you imagine this is the front of your sleeve here, that's the back up there. We're going to be attaching this square with a seam here, just a single seam to start off with. You can see these two are complete here. This is what it's going to look like on the outside of the garment. Lovely and neat and tidy. On the inside, what you can see here is that this is a run and fell seam. I've sewn this edge together first, edge to edge like that, and then I've turned under that seam allowance, lovely and neat, and I've finished it to about 1 inch off of the end. That's important because you don't want to be locking all this bit up here at this stage. All we're doing is just getting this first little bit complete. So to begin, lay both of your sleeve pieces out as they're going to be on the final garment. So if you imagine the main body piece is in the middle and your sleeves are sticking out either side. This is right side up. This is particularly important if you've got a fabric with a right and a wrong side. You really need to make sure at this stage you've got both of your sleeve pieces laid out properly, because once you've sewn these gusset pieces on, you're committed. So with your right sides facing up, you have your left hand sleeve here, your right hand sleeve here. We're going to take our gusset squares, right side to right side, and just line them up beautifully in the corners there. So again, the right side of your fabric is up. You take the right side of your gusset piece and lay it right side to right side, just there. We're going to be pinning or clipping along this edge and just a little way up here, so that this line here is what we're going to sew first of all. So you can see I've just put 1 clip on the side there to keep that where I want it, and 3 along the bottom. That's more than enough at this stage. If you're going to be pinning, pin perpendicular at right angles to your edge. If you're pinning along with the seam itself, sometimes your fabric can shift, but pinning vertically like that gives you a lot better control over where the fabric is. It just makes things a little bit easier in the long run, and it also means you're less likely to stab yourself. Haha. Now, we're not going to be sewing all the way across here. We're only going to be sewing from this edge to our seam allowance here, because you need to leave these open so that you can manipulate all of these seam allowances all round that sleeve and main body piece. You'll really appreciate having that free when it gets to that point. So what I'm going to do, usually I do this by eye now, but what I'd advise you to do first of all is just mark in your seam allowance just here. Now this is the wrong side of the fabric. It's not going to show on the outside, because remember we put these right side to right side together. If you happen to have got yourself one of these rather groovy sewing gauges, it can come in really handy here, because what you can do is use whichever seam allowance you're planning on using and just make your little mark there. That's equal both sides because it's a little square. And the same on the other side. You can use a ruler to do this, or you can do it by eye, whatever you're most comfortable with. Once that's done, you're ready to start sewing. Now, if you're really unsure of keeping your lines nice, you can lightly sketch in your seam allowance here. But what I would suggest is try practicing, get used to gauging it by eye, because there are going to be times when you can't draw in every single seam allowance. So it's worth practicing that as a skill. And it doesn't matter if you go off your line ever so slightly, it isn't going to be a big deal. If you're off by a quarter of an inch, perhaps, because you need to make sure you've got enough to turn under on these seams. But please don't worry about getting everything absolutely spot on. It doesn't need to be. Just get it as close as you can. So what we're now going to do is backstitch all the way along here. I use backstitch for this bit because these underarm gussets take quite a lot of force and strain, especially if you're going to be fighting in your kit. So it's worth using an extra strong stitch here. It takes a little bit longer, but it's worth it because it will make your garment last that much longer as well. Let's go. Now, as I mentioned before, we're only going to be sewing from this point, leaving our seam allowances clear. So we're going to fix our thread and then backstitch all the way along, right the way to the end of this edge. Now this one's a little bit different because it's going to be along the main front seam of the body. It's joining to a straight edge, so we don't have to worry about keeping our seam allowances free at this end. In fact, it actually makes it a little bit easier having that as a straight edge. So we're going to backstitch our way along. Then I'm going to show you how to fell down these seams and which direction to do it in. That's quite important. We're going to be doing the felling as we go with each piece, all the way up to almost where it joins the next one, so that at no point have you got to go back and do a load of felling at the end. Let's get started. So I'm going to make my first stitch here. I'm going to knot it because I want it to stay absolutely lovely and strong. So it's 2 stitches, and then as this comes through at the end, we make sure that that end's tucked through the stitch, and we tuck that one through the stitch as well. Pull it tight, and then we've got a lovely firm anchoring stitch. This end here, just leave loose. We're going to tuck it in when we fell this seam so it won't be visible. I'm just going to backstitch my way all the way along now.
Search of wisdom dear. 9 days and nights Lord Odin stayed, marked by sun and moon. For secrets great his sacrifice made, for magic of the runes. His eye to the well, he drank its waters clear, and unto him came knowledge of all he found at wisdom dear.
As you get to the end here, it's going to be a little bit tricky, but just really carefully do your last couple of stitches, keeping the tension nice and even over that end. Don't pull it too tight. Just pop it in, and with the last stitch, go through your loop and make a little knot just there. And that is your first seam complete. Now, I've used just a plain unbleached linen thread for this. It's lovely and strong, well spun. What I'm going to do for the next step is switch to the thread that I've drawn from the offcuts of this fabric, because the next part of the stitching is the felling, and that is going to be more visible on the right side. Back in a moment. So once you have your first line of back stitching in, what we're then going to do is bring this over, press it down. This is the right side of your fabric, both sides now. So we're going to flip it and we're going to treat this seam before we move on. So we've got our seam here. When we folded it over, we've tucked it back. The first thing that we're going to do is just trim off a little bit of this excess seam allowance here, because the whole thing is going to be folded back the other way, turned under, and the gusset seam allowance is going to be felled down to the main sleeve. This is a good rule of thumb to follow. You put your smaller pieces felled down onto your larger pieces. It's a pattern that we're going to follow all the way through. But before we do that, we need to trim away some of this seam allowance. We're not going to go all the way up to here because we want to keep our seam allowance the same here for when we start working on these bits. But I'm just going to trim that little bit out so that we can fold it over nicely to fell it down. Make sure you're not cutting the seam allowance underneath. You're just cutting the part that you're going to be folding over. And if you've started as I have, with everything laid out in the same way, you'll see that this is the uneven side of the back stitch. This side's nice and even, little single stitches showing on this side. This side, you can see where they loop over one another. So that's a good guide to tell you that you're cutting the right place. Just come up to where I've stitched, no further. So I'm going to fold that up out of the way. Then at this point you can press this, you can press it before you start doing this part. When you're working with the longer seams, we're absolutely going to press them, but for these underarm gussets you don't need to. You can just use your fingers to ease the linen where you want it to be. So we're going to tell it to go that way. We're going to check and make sure that none of this is bunching up and over, because what we don't want to do is have loops on the other side. So we want it nice and flat. And then we're going to pin our seam allowance into place, ready for stitching. First, we need to fold it under and tuck it down. I tend to go up and do the whole thing first because this little bit, it's not going to ping out of place. And then I'm going to pop my pins in. In this case, you do need to go horizontally with the seam allowance because you need to keep everything pinned nicely, and there isn't really enough room to do it vertically here, and it doesn't need it. But what you do need to bear in mind is keeping the tension even all the way along so that you're folding straight. You don't want to be folding at angles, and this will come into play later on when we're doing the gauze because they're cut on the bias, and that can be a little bit trickier. But on this bit, everything should be cut with the grain, and it should be nice and easy for you to get a nice neat line along there. So we popped a couple of pins in, that's all we need. I'm going to grab my needle and thread, and then we're going to whip stitch to about here, not all the way along. We're going to leave this little bit free so that we can manipulate it into place when we're doing the rest of the square. So we're going to pop our initial fixing stitch in here. I've doubled over that thread because it's not behaving quite as well as it did when I was sewing the neckline. It may be that we need to switch out for a different thread. We'll see how we get on. So I've secured my thread in there. If you've got it doubled, you can just slip it through the loop, or you can pop a little knot in the end. It's up to you. Just make sure that end is securely anchored. And then we're just going to whip stitch all the way along. Nice, neat stitches, close together. Take your time with it. And we'll have this seam felled down in no time. from just about the same distance again from the edge of the seam. I'm going to stop whip stitching here. You can pop a little knot in your last whip stitch if you like, but this isn't going to go anywhere. You can leave this long so that you can continue with one line of thread around the corner. That can sometimes be helpful even when you're doing these initial seams, because having that extra bit of thread means that there's continuity to the seam with a single piece of thread, and not every join is two separate pieces. So whichever option you prefer, either is fine. I'm going to leave that like that. That is all now ready to go. We can move on to the next stage with this one. If I flip it over, you can see on the right side it's just a tiny line of neat little whip stitches and your seam there. I'm going to go and get the other one of these done, and then we'll move on to attaching these long shoulder seams. See you in a little while. And we're back. We now have 4 sleeves, all with their gusset squares sewn to the front of the sleeve pieces. That's what you're seeing here, the 4 sleeve pieces. This is the front of the sleeve, and this is that first side of the gusset sewn on. If we flip these over, we can see there our line of back stitch and our line of whip stitching filling down that seam allowance, lovely and neat, turning the gusset back onto the sleeve piece. We're going to do the same thing all the way around, so at the end this gusset will have all of its seam allowances turned out to all the different pieces, but that'll make more sense as we go along. So now we're going to pin these sleeve pieces onto our main body piece and join them together. Okay, now we are ready to get these sleeve pieces pinned to our main body piece. I find it easier to do this sideways. I've laid out my main body piece with the front on my right and the back on my left. Please be aware that this is right side up. Make sure when you're starting to pin your pieces that you have your main body piece right side up. If you don't, the rest of it's not going to work. The first thing that we need to do is identify which sleeve piece belongs to which side. So, keeping them as a sleeve, what I'm going to do is just lay it down over the fabric. Doesn't have to be all the way across, just so that I am happy that I have got the right sleeve for the right side. I know because I'm looking at the finished side of that little seam we've just done. If we turn it over, we can see where we've whip stitched down. This is the right hand sleeve and that's the left. So for now, we're going to put our right hand sleeve away and we're going to work with the left one first of all. So we have our left hand sleeve piece right side up here, and we've got our main body piece right side up here. What we're going to do is unfold this and we're going to flip it over so that the right sides are together. And now we're going to make use of all those marks that we made during the cutting out process. So first of all, find where we marked the middle of our sleeve. We're going to line it up right there with our shoulder line. Now if you've got a 2-piece main body, this will be a seam. If you're using a single piece, you just have that little mark there to work with. We're going to lay it out, just check that we're happy that everything is balanced. What you should see is this line of back stitch that we've done lining up with that little mark there that we made that marks the bottom of the sleeve. Use that along just there, and then what you'll find is this mark there that we marked the bottom of the gusset will be around 1/2 inch if you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance over there, because we're only going to be sewing up to there. This is our seam allowance at the end here, and the same on the other side. You'll find that what you've got is your seam allowance left over on this end. Now if you're happy with all of that, you can go ahead and start to pin it all into place along this edge. If you find that somewhere along, especially with this seam, if you've used a bit more or a bit less than you expected, sometimes this won't all balance out quite perfectly. But just ease it in and find a nice balance between all of the two, focusing on keeping these pieces together. This main shoulder line is your priority here. So first of all, we're going to get that pinned into place. Now if you've marked both sides, what you can do is just fold it over, let it go, and you know that's in exactly the right place. Just make sure that there's no tension on the rest of that sleeve before you pin everything else. Make sure that everything is laying flat exactly back against your main body piece, because you don't want any creases further down pulling on this, pulling it out of place as you go. So I'm now going to get that all pinned into place all the way along, checking as I go that I'm happy with where all of that's lining up. So when we come to sew it, we can be absolutely confident that this sleeve is placed correctly.
Mothernight, sacrifice. Mothernight, Mothernight, sacrifice.
And again, at this point, if you want to, you can just pop a little dot or even draw a line before you start pinning to guide you along your seam allowance, so that you're making sure that you always have enough to turn. As I said before, we turn smaller pieces onto larger pieces. So the sleeve piece is going to be turned back when we fell this. This will be turned over onto this side, so the sleeve turns onto the main body. So if you want to do that, go ahead and get that done now. Once you're happy that all of that is right, what we're going to do is very carefully slide it all up the board, keeping this in place. And what you may want to do at this point is just pop a couple of pins in here, and I'll show you for why in just a moment. Once you've got that slid up out of the way, you're going to do exactly the same again with the right hand sleeve. Unfold it, flip it over so that the right sides are together. Line up roughly where you think you're going to be pinning, and then start getting everything just right.
Mothernight, Mothernight, sacrifice. Mothernight, Mothernight, sacrifice.
So once again, I've evened that up nicely. I've got it exactly where I want it, ready for sewing. I'm going to pop my little marks in there, and then we're going to look at what we do with these sleeves to keep them out of the way while we're doing this sewing, because what you don't want is these bits flapping around and getting in your way. So when you're happy, just slide the whole lot down so that you're working with the middle of the work again. Now you'll remember earlier we popped a couple of pins up there. We're just going to take those out now, and we're going to pin through the whole lot. I'm going to do the same here and then the same again here, so that we've got a few places marked to keep those sleeves absolutely where we want them, so that as we're moving everything around, there's not going to be any pulling or tugging on the more delicate seams. So what we've got here is both of those sleeve pieces and the second side of our square underarm gusset all beautifully pinned into place and ready to sew. If you remember from our neckline video, we folded up all this extra fabric, so that's nice and safely contained there while we work on these sleeves. Now, as you may recall, I've got an over tunic to get on with sewing as well, so I'd best get that pinned into place also. And as you can see, I've got the woolen one all pinned up in exactly the same way, except this time I've mostly used pins. As you can see, down the sides here, we're using that right angled pin technique again, so that we're not causing any stress in this direction. I've got some additional pins popped in the middle here, just to stop these sleeve pieces flapping about while I'm doing my sewing. Everything's lined up beautifully. So off I go to get these sewn up, and I'll see you in a little while. Now, when it comes time to sew our sleeve, remember this sleeve piece is going to be folded back onto the body piece. So the sleeve is the side that you will see facing upwards. The neatness of your stitching inside is important to you. Remember that, because you're going to need to sew on the side that's going to be seen for best results. If you're not bothered, it doesn't matter, but it does make it a little bit easier to work this way round. You can also swivel the whole lot and sew along the edge with it the other way round, whichever works best for you. So to fix our thread, we're going to start from the back. If you remember this side, we started from the front, so we're going to have to sew that thread tail in. If you start from the back, you don't have to do that extra step, so I'm going to show you that now. I'm going to leave our clip in place. I'm going to come through from the back, drawing our thread through until we've just got a nice little tail on the end to tie off onto. Make our first stitch here. I'm going to pull it through, but not all the way, and then I'm going to flip it over and go back through that hole that we just came through. So our needle will pop out this side, and again what you want to be thinking about is making sure that this needle comes through this loop. Draw it gently through, slowly but surely, and you'll have a really strong first stitch that isn't going to go anywhere. This little tail that we've got left here, we can tie on to the next one to double the strength. So we come back over to our working side. I'm going to continue with a back stitch on this bit, and I'll continue that back stitch to about there. Then I'll switch to a running back stitch. So that's a few running stitches and then a little back stitch, because this great big long length doesn't need to be back stitched all the way along. You absolutely can if you want to. Nothing stopping you. If you want to back stitch that, go for it. However, there's less stress on the top part of the sleeve here than there is on this underneath part. So you don't actually need the strength of the back stitch all the way along.
A Jarl in his long hall did stand and aloud called out to his fighting men, "Make thy kin proud!" The sweet mead was flowing, and yearn they for rowing. O'er the whale row to him they bowed.
Now when I get to this join, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to make sure my stitches are really nice, neat, small, deliberate stitches to make sure that that join is exceptionally strong. If you wish, you can turn your work over here to make sure you're getting your stitches exactly where you want them. Just take your time with this bit, make sure it's really lovely and strong. You can see there, I've continued the back stitch for around 1 inch or so just past that join. Now I'm going to switch to a running back stitch to get the rest of this filled in.
A jarl in his long hall did stand and aloud called out to his fighting men, "Make thy kin proud!" The sweet mead was flowing, and yearn they for rowing. O'er the whale row to him they bowed. And in the dawn breaking, good ships they did board, with blade and shield and the banner of their lord. With hearts of steel willing, the sails they were filling, and dragon heads gazed at the sea they adored. For far beyond the horizon the prize of gold and of silver where rich soil lies. No man would starve there where meadows are fair, to yield a fine harvest neath bluest of skies. Their women and children bid farewell fondly, a Volva gave prayer to the god of the sea.
Safe be thy crossing, upon the waves tossing, away to the west, now row heartily!
Now, when we reach that final stitch, we need to secure this down really well. So, another back stitch, and again at this point I just slip the loop over the needle so that I've got a really strong stitch in the back here. I go through and just bring this thread to the other side to keep it out of my way. For now, we may need to bring it forward when we get back round here. For now, tuck it to the back, and you have completed your first sleeve seam. Now, if you were working with a two-piece body and you had a seam here, over this edge for about 1 inch or so each side, I would suggest switching to back stitch, just as we did on this bit here and on the other end, because where that seam is, again, there's a slight bit of weakness there. So if there is a join there, you just want to make sure that you're adding a little bit of extra protection around those seams. I am going to go and I'm going to get the other side sewn up exactly the same way, and get the woolen ones sewn up exactly the same way, and then I will be back to show you what we're going to be doing with these edges. What I often do at this point is just press that seam before I go any further. See you soon. Once you've finished those initial joining stitches on both shoulders, we're going to stop here a moment and just press both of these seams to keep them lovely and crispy. Don't take out the pins that you've got holding all of the sleeves and everything together. Just take each side, side by side, and give it a press before we move on to the next step. Once that's all done, we're going to take out all of these pins that we have pinning all the sleeves together, and we're going to open this seam out. So once our arm is free, the first thing we're going to do is just pop that sleeve straight over the top so that we can see the right side of our work. I'm going to make sure we're happy with that line, and then just quickly press along here as well. You don't need to do much, just enough to encourage that seam nice and flat along here. Because what can sometimes happen is the fabric will move this way and make a little sort of loop there. It isn't the end of the world if this happens, it just keeps everything looking a little bit nicer if you can press it first to avoid that. So now it's time to flip it over. Now what we've got here is the wrong sides of both of our pieces. We've pushed that seam allowance that way briefly. It's actually going to end up being folded this way. So just as we did with the gusset, we need to trim out some of this seam allowance before we fold it, just to make the seams lay nice and flat. You can just choose to turn both if you wish, but it will make for bulkier seams. Don't cut too close to your stitching. Usually about halfway through or just under is more than enough. So we're going to trim that out, and then we're going to start pinning all this excess seam allowance down so we can fill that, get it all tucked under nice and neat. And once again, make sure that you are cutting no further along than the end of your stitch line. You can even come in a little way if you want to as well, just to be sure. Now, once you've got that cut out, what I would suggest is flipping the whole thing round so that when you're folding this down, you're folding away from you. It's just a little bit easier to do it that way. And also, when we come to pin, I always pin from that side to that side, so that when I'm felling, I'm working in this direction from right to left instead of left to right. It just suits my hands better. It may be that for you the technique works the other way, and this is where a bit of experimentation to find out what's going to be most comfortable and easy for you comes in, because all of us are a little bit different. Okay, now I'm in a nice position for me to work. You'll notice there's quite a lot of little fluffy bits of linen starting to fray along here. So at this point, what you can do is just run along with your scissors and just snip those off. making sure not to take anything out of the actual seam allowance itself. Just getting rid of those little frayed bits. Sometimes you can just fold them into the seam, but when you're learning, it's an awful lot easier if you haven't got those extra bits to worry about. And this is the same sort of step that we're going to be taking with all of the seams. As we go through the series, I won't show you the same things over and over again, but where it's particularly important, I will remind you, just in case you're popping back after a long time and need a bit of a refresher. So now that that's all nice and tidy, what we're going to do is press it all back in the direction we want it to go. Finger press it back briefly first and then make use of your iron. Having a steam function makes this a lot easier on linen because it will like to fight you. Once that's pressed, we're going to start felling back our seams, which means turning under these raw edges and securing down the fold so that we can whip stitch all the way along here, just as we did with this little tiny gusset bit over here. Now, something that I find particularly useful at this point is grabbing my little one of these and I slide it underneath like so that I'm pinning, when I'm popping my pins in, onto a hard surface. If you try and do this on your ironing board, you'll end up pinning it to your ironing board. It's almost inevitable. So if you haven't got one of these little mats that fits onto your ironing board, just move over to the table and do it there. Once it's all cooled down a little bit and you're happy that it's ready to turn, don't try and do it on the ironing board itself. I'm going to start in the beginning and pin my way out in either direction, always remembering to keep everything nice and perpendicular so that we're not pulling to one way or the other as we're going along, because it's really easy. You start at one end, you don't realise you're just putting enough force through that turned hem to pull it about a bit, and then you get puckers and little bits that can rub and annoy you. So take your time with it, get it all into place, make sure you're happy, and then you can proceed.
Mothernight, sacrifice. Mothernight, sacrifice. Hail the sun, thus reborn, praise the mother of the dawn. Bless the land, seeds we'll sow, sacrifice for crops to grow. You'll fire, burning bright, revel in the warmth and light. Wild hunt, flying high, hasty like the moonlit sky.
Now we have that all pinned into place, we are ready to whip stitch all the way along this seam. Again, start about 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch down from where that stitch line ends to make sure this bit's free to manipulate around the edges. Just lovely, slow, steady whip stitches, keeping your spacing as even as you can, aiming for 3 to 5 stitches per centimetre if you can. All the way down, and then again stop at the same distance away so that that end is also free. Now, while I'm busy pinning and sewing both sides of this linen garment, other me is going to talk to you quickly about the slight differences there are in getting this seam down if you're working with wool, especially wool that won't fray. So I'll see you in a while. Right, while she goes for a sit down and a snack before sewing, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's different if you're working with wool that isn't going to fray too much. Here you can see the finished seam on wool, how it looks if you turn the whole lot under just as you would with linen. I've left this little bit here to show you that what you can actually do is, instead of folding it under, if it's wool, is just simply lay that seam allowance down. You can trim it ever so slightly to neaten it up if you wish, and then you can just whip stitch with slightly larger whip stitches, just holding down that raw edge. If you have a look in my other playlists, you will find videos all about different ways of finishing hems. There's 2 videos that cover 6, I think, different hemming techniques. You could choose to whip stitch along this raw edge and then whip stitch it down. You could use the same technique that we've used around the neckline, where you lay a cord over that raw edge and then whip stitch the whole lot down. There are a few different options if your wool is too thick to easily turn. Luckily, this stuff is pretty pliable and it's easy enough for me to just turn it and whip stitch it, and the resulting seam isn't too thick for me. If you've got exceedingly thick wool, you're going to find it quite hard to get all of those turned, and it won't be necessary, especially if it's well fulled. If you're working with something like I was when I made my shoulder hem tunic, absolutely no need to double turn that, because the fluffiness and feltedness of the wool over time has sealed those together nicely. So there was no need for me to turn. This one is a little bit more fluffy and prone to fraying. It's not full at all. So I'd prefer to have everything tucked under. But what you're going to do is going to depend on your fabric choices. Again, if you've got any questions about any of this, please come and talk to me. Find me and I'll do my best to help. Right, other me's looking like she's somewhat recovered, so I'm going to go and join her, and we shall both finish off these sleeves and be back very soon to show you both sleeves fully attached and half of our gussets finished. Yay! And here we are with our shoulder seams all felled down all the way along to the ends here. You can see those 2 little bits I've left unfelled so that we can manipulate them with the next seam. I'm going to go now and do exactly the same again to the other sleeves I've got to fix on. And then once I've done that, what I usually do is press the garment from cuff to cuff all the way across this top section, just to get everything laying exactly where we want it for the next step in the process. I'll be back in a moment to show you where we're up to. And here we are. They're finally starting to look like our tunics and dresses. All of these shoulder seams are sewn in. They've had their seam treatment, so we've got nothing to come back and do on those at the end. Our neckline's looking lovely, and we're ready to start moving on to sewing up our sleeves and adding in this 3rd side of the gusset. Absolutely brilliant. If I fold this one back, you can see that woolen one there looking just the same. Both sides are at exactly the same stage, and working step by step like this really helps get your head around the construction process. Now I've got my clips still holding all my excess up out of the way. They're going to stay there for a couple more videos yet. So I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to get on to the next bit of the process. So now we've got our sleeve joined at the shoulder. We've got the first 2 sides of that underarm gusset squared away, and we've sewn down and finished those seams, so they're almost right to the edges, so there's very little to come back and finish later on. Fantastic. We're now ready to move on to sewing down the length of our sleeve and getting that 3rd side of the gusset sewn in. If you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments. I'll do my very best to answer them for you. And until then, happy sewing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.